I'd now like to welcome you to our first panel of the day, entitled The Future of CVE. Over the past 2 decades, efforts to prevent and counter violent extremism have increasingly focused on working with local communities, civil society, faith-based organizations, municipalities, and others to craft context-dependent strategies. While efforts have been difficult to assess and evaluate, there has been widespread consensus that military means cannot alone fight extremism. This session will examine lessons learned, good practices, and challenges derived from experiences in different regions. It is my pleasure to introduce the moderator for this panel, Michael Masters, who is president of the board of directors of the Soufan Center and the national director and CEO of the Secure Community Network. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you. To say again, we have a fantastic panel for all of you. Dr. Fatima Akilu, the executive director of the Neem Foundation of Nigeria, also a university educator and an advocate for marginalized groups working in the area of psychology and health for more than 2 decades. She has held a number of critical positions. Until recently, she was the director of the Behavioral Analysis and Strategic Communication Unit in the Office of the National Security Advisor, which developed an innovative, multi-pronged approach to the issue of countering violent extremism. Previously, the head of communication for the senior special assistant to the president as well. And most interesting, she has authored more than 17 children's books and has published articles on homelessness and mental health as well. A longtime colleague, although just having the pleasure of meeting her in person over the last few days. Qudus Malik, Esquire, Executive Director of Global Lawyers for Refugees, with over 15 years of legal experience in the fields of intellectual property law, international human rights law, and refugee and migration policy. He has led efforts to address religious repression of minority communities in various countries in South Asia, Central Asia, and the Middle East. He regularly briefs leaders around the world, to include at the U.S. Department of State, United Nations Human Rights Council, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and various human rights NGOs. He worked for a leading international law firm in New York previously and served as a U.S. Peace Corps volunteer in Tanzania. He holds a JD from Columbia Law School and LLM in International Human Rights Law from Georgetown University Law Center. And joining us virtually, last but certainly not least, Jeppe Albers, the executive director of Nordic Safe Cities, a nonprofit organization that was formed in 2016. He founded it with the Nordic Council of Ministers and led the alliance since its inception, working with member cities from Norway, Finland, Denmark, Sweden, and Iceland to prevent extremism and polarization. Previously worked in the Danish Foreign Ministry and the Danish Arts Council. So, my pleasure to welcome all 3 of you with us today. And I'd like to start with a general question for each of you to share a few minutes about your perspective on the state of extremism around the world and why this conversation is important. And Dr. Akilu, we'll start with you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your kind introduction. I think, firstly, for me, when I think about extremism, I really become humbled by the limits of my own imagination. What I see is that I think years ago, before we started talking about CVE, I think Ali Soufan was talking about the audacity of the imagination of extremists, and we see it more and more. Their ability to adapt, to become new. We are looking at systems that are still very slow, very clangy, and doesn't give us the flexibility to really stretch, as I said, the limits of our own imagination to see where the next tipping point could be. For example, the COVID vaccine has shown me really some of our limitations. While we have redirected all our resources to look at health, terrorists have seen the vacuum that it has created. In Nigeria, where I work with both Boko Haram and Islamic State West Africa Province, they have moved into these spaces and they have been providing governance type of structures in places that government has left. So what does that tell the people? It tells the people that these extremist groups are the ones who are listening to their marginalization issues, their lack of belonging, and also the ability to organize at a time where they feel really left out. Secondly, another thing that I see is that we don't seem to be able to recognize tipping points. Right now, we're talking about right-wing extremism in the West, but these groups have been around. I lived in America more than 2 decades ago in upstate New York, and they were these groups that were embedded within there. So I think we must always look beneath what's going on. And I will also end by saying that sometimes when we think about extremism, we're looking at certain groups. When we think about jihadism, we're thinking that it's a disease of the young. But I have now spent lots of time with people who are recruited into these groups, and I've seen people of all age groups and all genders. So to end, I just want us to broaden our imagination when we think about extremism and what are going to be the next things that we'll see in this area. So thank you.
Thank you. Kudus, your reactions. You hit the...
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and it's a great honor to be in Doha for this. Extremism, this is a generational struggle. It's something that, it's not Muslim extremism, it's not Christian extremism, it's not brown extremism or white extremism. It's a disease, and it doesn't matter what you call it, but it affects all peace-loving people equally. The last 20 years, the US has spent, by some estimates, up to $6 trillion fighting terrorism and extremism. 10,000 Americans have died in this struggle. 50,000 have been wounded. I heard the Prime Minister of Pakistan talk about 80,000 Pakistanis have died in this fight as well. Afghans, all over the world. So this is an enemy that targets everybody equally. It's not just targeting the US, it's targeting, in some ways, it's targeting Muslim countries more so than it's targeting the West. And the catastrophic damage that it's doing. But despite everything that the world has done, all of this resource being spent in trying to fight this, the US Congress commissioned a task force of the US Institute of Peace a couple of years ago. And they said that based on their assessment, all of our efforts to counter violent extremism are failing. And we need a new strategy. And it's shocking. After 20 years, we now are again talking about requiring a new strategy to combat this. And what is the data? And 20 years ago, today we have 5 times more terrorist attacks in the world. We have 3 times more jihadis in the world. We have more jihadi groups, twice as many jihadi groups who are active, 19 countries. Fighters from 100 countries are now joining this so-called misguided jihad. And so that means that all of the data is trending against what the effort of the global community is. So then the question is, how do we understand and start to combat this? I think one of the biggest blunders that we have committed in trying to address this issue and trying to formalize a strategy is that we defined extremism and terrorism in terms of religion, in terms of Islam being responsible for this, in terms of Muslims being the perpetrators of this. We just had an attack yesterday in Norway. We don't know whether it's a terror attack or not, but the reality of a Muslim's life is that when you see an attack like this, your first hope and pray is that I hope that this is not a Muslim. And you see when an attack happens, if it's a Muslim, it's called Muslim extremism, but if it's not a Muslim, all of a sudden religion drops out and it becomes white extremism, white supremacy, radical right. And I think that that's been, the Holy Quran has beautiful teachings. It says, La ikraha fid din, one of the most eloquent articulations of religious freedom 1,400 years ago, that there's no compulsion in religion, that persecution is worse than murder. So the Muslim world it's in the DNA of the Muslim world to fight extremism. And I think that when we define this in terms of religion, I think we have done a big disservice. And unfortunately, the biggest threat facing the world today is not Muslim extremism. It is far-right, radical, at least in the US and several other countries. And I think that, just think about if we defined it as in terms of religion, it would almost be impossible to address it. So I think that those are the types of things that we really need to be cognizant of.
Thanks so much. Jeppe and Kudus mentioned this. Obviously, our thoughts and prayers are with the people who have been impacted by the attack in the last 24 hours. And it remains to be seen, at least from the last reports, what the motivation is. But I think it does say something that almost immediately the conjecture is that this may be an instance of radicalization or extremism on some side of the equation, whatever it might be. I'm curious if you could comment on that and share your perspective with it, and then contextualize it in the larger work that you've been doing with Nordic Safe Cities.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you very much also for my part from taking part in this important conversation. First of all, there's not a lot of information out yet in terms of the attack yesterday, but I think just the fact that the perpetrator used a bow and an arrow could point to the fact that he has read and maybe been inspired by some things that has happened around far-right movements, and maybe has used the internet as his key source to figure out or become radicalized. That is at least some of the discussions here, and a lot of very wise things have already been said in this opening question. I think my first point would say that from a Nordic, Scandinavian, Northern European perspective here, the internet has been and is the game changer today and tomorrow, at least from the past 10 years and going forward. The ability for a lot of different organizations and individuals to reach people and get them inspiration, have them inspired by different forms of motives is extreme, and the pace at which you can radicalize people on the internet, judged on the terrorism cases here in Scandinavia, it goes very, very fast. I think that the main point would be that in order to address extremism today, we need to be in the digital arena, in the prevent system, much more than we have been. We need to have a digital mindset and start acting online, prevent workers. So from my experience, it would be school teachers, social workers, people who work in the early broad prevention. 10 years ago, this was a conversation, maybe 15 years, this was a conversation we had. In 2014, we were a little bit behind. We had the propaganda from ISIS, and the content moderation was not up on the social media sites. The professionals were not equipped to deal with this conversation and the threat. And also today, we see the evolution and the hybrid loose organizations, different forms of far-right, radical right movements that we fully cannot capture, and the system is not geared to work to prevent these kind of things, to prevent people from being radicalized online. So this is, I think, one of the initial and obvious points that have been stated around this conference. Also, as Dr. Akilu said, I think the new forms of extremism, or what polarizes a conversation, climate, tech, anti-vaccine, the understanding and the definitional framework of what constitutes extremism is something that we need to look at least here from a European perspective. So CVE, PVE, the V, the violent part, I think we need to look also at the non-violent part. And that's at least, I think, one of the big arenas going forward. I do not have all the answers. This is obviously difficult because it's a borderline of legislation, at least here in Scandinavia. But to act on democracy crimes, hate speech, everyday racism, and these kind of conversations, this is going to be the future of an important step in the prevention of extremism.
Thanks. You mentioned, and I want to recognize Nordic Safe Cities as being a partner for this forum, and we appreciate that partnership. You mentioned the idea of a multidisciplinary approach. I'd love if you could share with us your the development of the thinking around that over the last 5 years since you founded Nordic Safe Cities, and resistance that you may have faced to that, people who believed that they could arrest their way out of this problem, and how you've overcome that in the areas that you're working in.
Well, first of all, the way that the prevention of extremism is embedded in the Nordic countries, Scandinavian countries, is in a general crime prevention structure. And it has actually been that way since the 70s in Denmark and 80s in Norway, etc. So I would say the foundation is there, and the way to operate is traditional, you can say, Northern Scandinavian country to build an early and systemic efforts to build inclusion and build social cohesion and these things to promote values, democracy, freedom of speech, equality, human rights. So this foundation has been laid, and it's very much has been the starting point for a while. With that foundation, the organizational framework has been around a system where you share information early on if you have an indication of someone being radicalized, and that is the multi-level governance structure here, where you have health services, social services, schools, the police and the municipality. They have the ability to talk about a potential radicalization case before it turns into violence. So that is kind of the basics of the structure. And I think that has worked well in many aspects. Obviously, also as what Dr. Akilu said here, this system here is also challenged by some of the new forms and target groups. So what you're looking at here is a system that needs to be a little bit transformed. It is not operating digitally enough. There's no digital mindset in the new social workers coming out here. The governance models, the way they risk assess people is primarily young people because it's designed within a welfare frame. So how do you address older adolescents, if it's REMV, a flock of lone wolves, mostly white men? Do you spot them with a traditional system? And also more, you can say, radical, alt-right, whatever definition you use them here, extremists, far-right extremists, we would call them here. How do you address people who don't lack resources? These are not necessarily people you can give resources, jobs, opportunities, like it is in traditional, more kind of lower social economic backgrounds where we look. So how do you address these more, well-off people in the prevention of extremism and the spread of their ideology? This is a little bit some of the, I think, future. And the big dilemma, as I said here, is kind of what do you do with, it's an old dilemma, the freedom of speech versus hate. How do you navigate on the invisible line of decency and work on hate speech and some of the root causes, everyday racism in some of these fields?
Pivoting from that, Dr. Akilu, I would love for you to walk us through the strategy that you developed, that multi-pronged, cross-disciplinary strategy that you really worked on and in many ways innovated. Well, you mentioned the sort of the forefront of this. You were at the forefront of this before we had lots of people that were CVE experts. You were doing it in the field and practicing this. Could you talk to us about that model that you developed and what you found worked well and where the challenges were?
Thank you so much. Yes, many years ago, I was invited by government to design a soft approach to their counterterrorism effort. And the first thing I found was that the soft approach was really, really hard. Talking to multiple, at that time, commanders that had been captured by the government, Boko Haram commanders, I learned a couple of things. First of all, to really counter at that time, the growing numbers of young people that were not only joining Boko Haram, but were joining Islamic State at the time, we would have to do a couple of things. One was to change our society. This was a society which at the time was in denial of the issues, the problem. I was told that these were not Nigerians, they were foreigners who were invading our country. Nigerians don't behave in this way. So that was the first thing. The second thing was to understand why these young people were taking up arms against the state, really briefing against the state and wanting to form their own society. And it was much more complex than just the search for meaning, marginalization, lack of jobs. It was that and a lot more. They just didn't feel that they fitted into what we were providing. There was no anchor for them within communities and within society. And how do we counter that? Would it be a program that just targeted at those particular youth? Do we design a program that looked at society as a whole? And how do you design a program that looks at society and wants you to change some cultural practices that have been around for generations? And could we do it within government? Does it have to be outside of government? So this is really the context in which we try to design this program. The first thing we had to do was to understand that we had to change our laws. The government very quickly changed their laws, brought in terrorism financing laws, brought in laws that allowed them to address certain parts of the issue. But that wasn't my job. My job was to address more the societal issues. The first thing I looked at, I know a lot of people really look at terrorists or people who join these movements, but we don't look at victims. We don't look at the communities that they live in. In Nigeria, for every person who joins an insurgent group, there's probably 1,000 victims. And I knew that if we didn't focus on victims, they will be the next line in terms of recruitment. So what did we do? We looked at the vulnerabilities within the society and people who were potential victims. What we found was that they were gaps in education. Education, not in the sense of the training that you get in school, but the ability to think in an expansive way, critical thinking, if you like, logical reasoning, imaginative thinking. That was missing in the education that lots of people were getting. So we made education a national security priority. And therefore, we were able to work with schools to develop curriculums that address some of these things. The second thing that we looked at, because I'm a psychologist and because I think it's important, we looked at trauma. What is the role of trauma for both people who join these kinds of outgroups, and what is the role of trauma for the people who are left behind within the society, and how does trauma play a role for the victims? In the case of Boko Haram, I know that we're very familiar with the 200 and something odd girls that were kidnapped from the Chibok school, but the reality is tens of thousands more were kidnapped and are brought back into society. So we had to address their trauma needs. In addition to looking at the wider society, we had to look at the role of the federal government, we had to look at the role of the state government and the local government and bring all those together. Once you brought government together across several ministries, so we looked at the role that things like sports played in keeping people anchored, youth really motivated to stay within the society and the communities that we wanted them to stay within. So Ministry of Sports was brought in. We looked at communication. How do we reach them? At the time, there were a lot of groups. We got help from RUSI, I know they're here, from the US government as well, who were doing messaging and counter-narratives. At the time, it was very popular. But when we were looking at those counter-narratives and the people that I was working with that formed some of the founders of Boko Haram, it wasn't really resonating. Those were not the messages that they wanted to hear. So we had to look at communication in a whole different way. We had to work with them to really help us understand what were the messages that we could provide for people to either get them to leave the group and not join. And it's not a message of really don't join the group or counter-narrative. It's really what are we doing to change our society and our systems to make them want to stay? What are we providing beyond the jobs, beyond opportunities? All of those youth wanted to self-actualize, but they just want platforms for them to self-actualize in the way that they wanted to be seen, to be heard. So we also introduced voluntary service, things that were meaningful for them to give back to their community. In a nutshell, the program consisted of targeting the people who had already joined, so a de-radicalization that was prison-based, rehabilitation for those that were in the community. We had education, we had sports, we had community engagement, we had psychology, and we also worked with civil society and brought them into government. So we had a network of civil society that worked for the very first time with the security sector in Nigeria. So they provided us with the information that we needed. And really, really importantly, we wanted everything that we did to be evidence-based. So we worked with a lot of universities, we gathered a lot of data, and now out of government, we continue to gather a lot of data and really to analyze and understand what we're doing. In a way, what we tried to do was something very, very difficult, a whole of society approach. And I think the jury's still out whether that has been achieved, but I think the only way to really combat what we experienced is to bring everybody together. So I've seen it both within government and now I'm out of government. I've seen the strengths that you can have when you're in government, the might of government, the ability to change things much more quickly. But as part of civil society, I'm also on the ground. I can hear what people are saying, what people are feeling, and their lived experiences, and I can feed that information back to government. And unless we work together, I think we'll be talking about this for the next 20, 30, 40 years.
Jeppe, what resonates from what Fatima shared about her experiences? And if you had a question as have been developing the program over the last 5 years that you could pose to her based on that experience, what would it be?
A lot of this resonates and complements. I think this is a very comprehensive approach as far as I understand it. The way that you engage all the stakeholders and build kind of a voice for everybody and listen to them early on and have individual roles as civil society, as part of the government, or as maybe the police. It's very similar to the way things have been formed here in the Nordics, and the way of operating with trauma and having that perspective is also something I've seen in particular in Norway after the events in 2011, where there's a national trauma and identity. Could this actually happen in Norway, that one of our own perpetrated a far-right assault? So the methodology around working with trauma on an identity scale and in government is also something I can recognize. One question, I would say, who are the new actors to put in a whole of society approach in that? Who's missing in the equation? That would be my question.
Which of the two of you would like to take a stab at answering the question?
Thank you so much for your question. I think yesterday we talked a little bit about the role of business. We don't talk enough about business and what they can do. I think business are very risk averse is what we found. But when we persuaded them and we get them to work in conflict zones, some of these places are ungoverned spaces where there's not much reach, there are not much jobs, and they place things, very simple things like factories and stuff. It has been transformative. So I would say that business has been a bit missing from this conversation today, and they should play a much more central role.
I think relationships with tech companies, with social media platforms, I think that on a broader scale, I think that that's something that we see that is the new frontier of this. I think that you see bad actors using it to further restrict space, and governments that are very willing to crack down on what they perceive to be against their interest are not willing to interfere. And in fact, the tech companies use this, the fact that a certain country has a law that restricts religious freedom. The tech company will support that law, even though the whole international community has a consensus that that law is illegal. So I think that that conversation needs to happen. The users are in all of these societies, and I think that we have to send a message to the tech companies that and social media platforms that they have a lot of responsibility that they're not sharing in this as well.
It's a great point, and it goes back to Jeppe's comment in his opening remarks about the internet. Do you have much optimism that the tech companies are interested in actually dealing with this?
Personally, I don't have. I mean, from what I've seen, we had a meeting with really the top brass of one of the giants in this space over an issue where they were removing religious content belonging to a particular religious minority in a country. And there's really no difference. It looks exactly the same, but just because it's coming from that community, they remove it. And when we had this meeting, and there were people from different parts of the world who were at this meeting, and the first thing they did was different people were reaching out to them, and they said, oh, why don't we just have one meeting where everybody comes in? So you neutralize everybody. And they basically said that, look, we have to enforce or implement the laws that this country has, and this is against that country's law, even though the global consensus on those laws is that those laws are draconian. They are against they violate international law. But this company, it's a US-based company, and they were very blatant about it. That they said that, look, this is not something we do. We have a bottom line, and we can't get into the weeds on this. And I think that is, and we see that across these different platforms where the business interest trumps a responsibility that these companies have to uphold human rights, to uphold religious freedom. And I think that the governments themselves, right? I think that the same government that is willing to shut down websites because, and restrict religious freedom is not willing to go after the majority narrative that is being expressed online in a very violent way against minorities. And they say that, look, and in fact, they encourage it. So I think that is the space where a lot of these, I think a lot of progress can be made, but I think that the tech companies and the social media platforms will have to be put under some sort of pressure and I know that in the US this dialogue and conversation is progressing very slowly, but I think that I know that there's a lot of effort from the government to try and have this as part of the conversation.
And it seems, and Jeppe, maybe you can address this, that it's more pernicious than that they let it go. I mean, if we read the commentary from the Facebook whistleblower, she has alleged, and the data that she has presented indicates that they not only are aware of the harm, they know of the harm actively, and they're allowing it to exist because it serves the business interests. And I'm curious how you deal with that when you're trying to combat the impact on the ground of violent extremism.
Well, I completely agree with everything Koda says here, and I would say it's another body that needs to take care of this than an organization working at a local level, even though there's mayors represented in cities here in our network. What we have done instead, not to dodge the question, but is actually just to start to take the necessary action on social media in the prevent work and figure out how can you do that. And then hopefully the platforms will be regulated at some point soon. But I think for the time being and the importance of being out there just over the course of the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, artificial intelligence can help stakeholders get a lot of data online within their local digital geography. It can be done not as intelligence gathering or monitoring of people, but in very new, sophisticated ways. And we have seen here how localized data can actually change the mindset of prevent workers, so that everyday police, school teachers, social workers around Scandinavia the discussion is not should we be online to prevent, it is where should we be online, how should we do it, what kind of hate and misinformation should we counter, and what is the role of civil society, police, and municipality, for example. So this is the conversation that is starting to happen here, and that is the more you get a digital conversation where it's around your local community, the level of hate, the conversation around an area such as the city of Malmö, and it's not just the black box of the internet. That makes the prevent work easier. So this is something we're working on, and a lot of other people are working on. I think we need to go in this direction. We can't wait for the tech companies in the prevent work. And some of the actions seen here in this work is obviously police taking a more proactive role on the internet, and this is preventive policing. Oslo has a police force, Helsinki has a police force. You also have a lot of new initiatives where politicians here in Scandinavia, they try to do a code of conduct where they agree on what a safe democracy is, have maybe a code of conduct on their own platforms, what is allowed to say, what is not allowed to say. It's okay to disagree, but not spur hate and disinformation. So this kind of acting on online extremism from politicians, from police and authorities, and also from civil society. This is something I think we can work on in terms of the digital space.
In terms of working on that Kudus, I want to go back to something that you mentioned in your opening comments related to how people receive different actors, whether it's from the Muslim community. You mentioned when it comes from the other side, it's not contextualized as religious, it's just simply white supremacists. But I want to connect that to the tech companies and the deplatforming issue, because one of the main criticisms on being able to work in the tech space and countering violent extremism is the slowness in which the tech companies work to remove content from those that adhere to supremacist ideology, as opposed to the other side, which you could argue they were slow in, but once they got moving, they moved quicker. ISIS content and so forth. And I'm curious for your perceptions on that.
Michael, I'm cynical when it comes to tech companies, unfortunately. I think that
that's why I asked you the question.
I think that it's all business. I think that they evaluate, what positions they should take. And when you talk about moving slowly, they, in many cases, they don't move at all. And they just check a box and they'll give you this lip service and they'll go away. They're not interested in doing the right thing, right? Which you would hope that, you have the resources, you have huge responsibility. They are there because of us. And I think that they're not sharing in the burden that all of us have, and we have to share in it. So I think that the focus on the bottom line and this really callous disregard towards the consequences of their content management, I think that they need to look at it more carefully. And in fact, this is a case, again, this is in Pakistan, where this was end of last year, there were very sophisticated troll farming types of activity where you had hundreds of content being uploaded against a vulnerable religious minority, Ahmadi Muslims in Pakistan, from a part of the country that has almost no internet, right? And it was a coordinated, highly sophisticated attack. And when that was brought to their attention, their response was, that sorry, we can't do anything. So I think that it's really unfortunate. And I think that because online accounts and online persecution, I think, is increasing, right? The use of that is in one direction. So I think that unless the companies themselves get involved, I think that it will continue to become a much bigger problem.
More broadly than and thank you for the answer, than the tech companies on the messaging piece, I'm curious if, how we think about messaging more broadly. One of the things that Ali Soufan has noted both in his speaking, but also in his writing, is the notion that while we have made incredible tactical advances against the fight against extremists, violent extremists, when you think about Al-Qaeda and the so-called Islamic State, imprisoning or eliminating leadership, reducing territory, he notes that we've failed in a broader strategic sense. We often get the messenger, as he notes about bin Laden, but we don't kill the message. And that goes to what you were saying earlier about the incredible growth of some of these ideologies on all sides. What role, how do we think about that beyond the tech companies? Are we, in terms of a larger civil society question on strategic narratives and countering messaging?
I think that that's how we beat this thing, right? I mean, there's no doubt that the right counter messaging and having the right narrative, so as I'm a Muslim, I'm an Ahmadi Muslim, and I think that when you look at the antidote for all of this, right, and I'm talking about this now just purely from a Muslim standpoint, Islamic standpoint, the antidote is within Islam, right? We don't need to, and instead of being, I think that the messaging is unfortunately sometimes lost when it comes to the Muslim world because of who is bringing it. Making the argument for religious freedom as a Western innovation is not as helpful as making the argument that the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, met a Christian delegation from Najran in his mosque, and he said that I will leave so you can pray in this mosque, right? That is, or there are sayings of the Holy Prophet that say that you teach if you educate your daughter, that you will earn Jannah, right? Heaven. And so when you talk to the Taliban, I think I have always believed it, and I've always said this, that when we make the religious argument to a population, you have to contextualize. It's not, you can't have a cookie cutter approach. So for the Muslim world, I think that the strongest argument is from within Islam. We don't have to be, I think the problem is that we have our own, not we, but the West has deep-rooted, I don't want to say Islamophobia, that's too harsh maybe, but prejudice of the fear of the other, right? I was reading this interesting article that when coffee was first imported into the UK in the 17th century, the ale manufacturers, ale houses, their business interest was kind of like Starbucks coming in and taking over the whole neighborhood. And they started this really vicious campaign calling coffee beans Muhammad berries, right? That, oh, this is you drink this drink and it's going to somehow turn you into irrational. There was not a single Muslim in the US in the 1700s when there were plays on Broadway that were depicting Islam as the Antichrist, right? So you have this perception that somehow the world, the US or the Western world was ambivalent about Islam, and all of a sudden Muslims started to hijack planes and started bombing buildings, and that was their first introduction to Islam. I think that it's the other way around. I think that those biases are unfortunately there, and we as Muslims need to do a better job of showing the beauty of Islam. And I think that that is the only type of re-education that will so I'll give you one last example. So, we were talking about this yesterday. There's this concept of a messianic figure coming in Islam who is going to establish the reign of Islam by killing everybody that disagrees with him, right? This idea of a bloody Mahdi or a bloody Messiah. And it's not just unique to Islam, it's unique to other religions, it's also in other religions. But I think that that ideology, I think that if you believe that that person is going to be a peaceful person, right? The victory of Islam comes through peaceful means. You are counter-messaging in a way that we are not now. And I think that that oxygen has to be removed from the room.
Thank you so much. I think that there's probably, as an aside, your anecdote about coffee is interesting. There's probably a good dissertation somewhere about the impact of beverages and the manifestation of political ideology through that, as I'm thinking about the American relationship with coffee and tea and our own independence. But that's a different story. Fatima, I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about the messaging from your perspective in the programming that you did and thoughts on how we think about developing strategic narratives or counter narratives? And is there a difference? Is there a difference between a counter narrative and a strategic narrative?
Thank you. And I have to say that I agree with you. We are the message. I think we spend so much time and so much money really crafting these messages and counter-narratives. When I go to villages and communities, what I see is young people with no role models. What does it mean to be, for example, I'm also Muslim, when I go to these Muslim communities, what does it mean to be a good Muslim? To have a place in society, to do all the things that the Quran says makes us a good person. Why are you following Abu Bakr Sheko to get those messages? And so to me, that is the most important message. You know, you see a woman who's educated, who is working, and to me, that is a counter-narrative in a community where they're marrying off their daughters at age 11. We have a school, for example, for young women in northeast Nigeria. That school is a counter-message in its own right, because we've taken a third of biological children of Boko Haram, a third of the biological children of the civilian JTF who fought Boko Haram, and the other third are victims of Boko Haram or civilian JTF excesses. So we brought all girls, 100. We brought them all into this school, and we said, you can be different. They can be a different alternative pathway for you. Without this school, all those girls would have been married at 11. And then we brought their mothers, because all their fathers are dead, and said to them, you can support your children to show that society is different. So now you go to the school, you have young girls who want to be lawyers, who want to be pilots, who want to be journalists. What more powerful counter-narrative in terms of women's and girls' right to education? And so when I look at the whole industry of narratives and counter-narratives, for me, I like to work with people as examples. We work with imams, for example. We work with imams in mosques, and we say to them, this is what you tell these young people about being a Muslim in your society. What is your own responsibility to your society? It's not just about giving you a message not to join a terrorist group. You know, there are big global programs that are counter-narratives. The Peace Corps, for me, is a counter-narrative. In UK, you have the Duke of Edinburgh Award scheme that really takes people on adventures, both to expand the mind and the body. So I don't think about narratives as messaging. They're not programs on the radio or on the internet. They are that and much, much more. It's examples of how we can live our life differently, how we can be role models, how we can remake our society, but to show them that it's possible. When you have a message that's on the radio or on the internet, sometimes they don't see themselves in it. So it's how do you teach this child, I can excel in science when the opportunity for education is blocked? How do you work with the education authorities to ensure that these children can be enrolled in school? So it's a bit of a different alternative, but that's how I see counter-narratives and narratives within my own work.
Jeppe, do you want to add in from the Zoom machine?
Add in just a brief remark. I very much agree with the two panelists here, and a lot of the programming, obviously, CVE, PCVE has come in the tail of counterterrorism, and that's where the mix, as well as I see it, has often gone wrong, also in the messaging, in the programming. And I think there's similar learnings from around here. The prevention efforts should be led by civil society or municipalities or someone who has a neutral yet respectful conversation with the community, whom the community respects. And at that level, it's not about PCVE or CT. It's about peace building. It's about ensuring that the kids, the friends, the families in, around, in a community can stay away from some of the extremism and some of the wars that will hunt them in the end. So you have to have that, not make an entire minority a suspect, just as Kola said. This is one of the big mistakes, I think, from the past, but have a broad conversation and see people as partners of a joint target in a community. And one short example here is also here in Copenhagen, where I am, we initiated back in 2016 a conversation around civil society, and there was a lot of mosques who were not at that point engaged in the conversation here in this city around the topic of radicalization. And this has also been maybe done wrong at some point here when you have securitized an entire community, maybe a religion. But we brought in someone who they respected, and we spoke around the safety for the children who came to these areas. And initially, as also said here, it is the actions from the organizations itself that speak. It's not necessarily the programming, but the real change is when some of the young leaders from some of these organizations went to the streets as role models. But this is just an example of from here where we try to do another more kind of almost a program where you don't talk about violent extremism or radicalization, but future safety for everyone in the community.
Would we, this is to everybody, but would we be placed to move away from the term CVE when I think about the securitization point that you made? And one of the things when we were working on this, on programming in the United States, we found many communities, and particularly the Muslim community, because of things like the mosque surveillance program undertaken by the NYPD and others, saw CVE as, and the term specifically, as a other way to engage in the securitization of the relationship and to engage in surveillance and undermine the community. Given all that history, would we be well placed to do exactly what you're talking about, Jeppe, in concept, but formally, and just abandon that term CVE and think of it entirely differently?
Was that to me first, or?
Well, you know.
I didn't. Sorry.
You can
this is a
take
big
it
question.
first. We've
Okay,
nominated
this is a
you
very
by
big
silence.
question. It's an entire conference on its own almost. I think the terminology, and I don't know, to turn back the clock 20 years is difficult. And PCVE means so many different things across the world, because it's an architecture post 9/11 that is built into maybe already existing or programs at a local level. I believe the most successful programs, they don't use this terminology. They use the language, the culture, based on the communication and things that work on the ground. So most things I've seen, they have adapted this concept into their existing structure. This is what we've done here as well. PCV sometimes is something we have to say when we go to abroad, because we have to fit it into this narrative. And it has much to do, PCV here, in terms of with, I would call it prevention of violent extremism, prevention of terrorism. That is something people will understand here. And I would also say that the future of it would be to erase the V, and talk about prevention of racism, hate, extremism towards minorities. So that's more an everyday understanding that that people understand, and not more a kind of an ambivalent term in terms of what's the difference between violent extremism and terrorism, which a lot of people do not understand when they initially do the programming. But just to open the conversation on this difficult topic.
It's a great point, and I guess my thought on it was, it seems if we're not using it in the field and with the community because we know it doesn't resonate well, are we being not academically dishonest by when we all come together using the term at conferences and events like this?
I think it's a great point. But my personal view on this is that I don't think that communities should be concerned about the aspect of securitization, right? I mean, as a Muslim minority living in the West, I want the opportunity to share my faith with anybody that comes in. If it's an FBI agent, I don't care, because the true understanding, right? I think that sometimes we get too lost in these terms and it becomes artificial. When you connect with somebody as a person on a human level, it doesn't matter what badge they have or what your perspective is. I think that having that in some ways that space needs to be there. And I'm not a big proponent of this critique of the CVE kind of model that certain communities feel targeted by it. I don't think there's any need to be targeted. If there's a very, very prominent religious leader in the UK who actually said that, look, you can record, you're probably recording anyways, and record these things, right? I mean, why is this a political issue, or why is this an issue that I'm not changing what I am saying to my congregation? And if that gives you that, the confidence and the faith that this is not a risk, I don't think that we should be against it personally. I know that this is probably not the majority view on this, but I think that if it's a partnership, I don't think, and this is true for a lot of other countries as well, where sometimes countries have to take certain actions because of their own security, and we should respect that. And I think that the underlying trust needs to be there, and not hide behind these labels, which I think doesn't move. The goal is not the goal is to beat this extremist ideology, right, wherever it's coming from, and have peace in society. And I think that as long as we're moving in that direction, I think that every step we take is helpful.
Thank you. Fatima, do you have a reaction?
I agree with both of you. I really don't think about the terms PVE, CVE, except when I'm in conferences, on the ground, we're looking at what is the problem, how do you solve it? It's such, and it's different for every country, every region. In Nigeria, we're moving towards really connecting development with humanitarian aid, with psychology, with communication, education, in terms of addressing the issues. So when we focus so much on terminology, sometimes we miss the point, and also the evolving nature. When I started, we're looking at extremism, maybe Islamically inspired extremism. Now we're looking at just general intolerance that is spilling into cultural issues and causing so much unrest. So we're always running, if you like, or sprinting to catch up to the next issue. And so therefore, I don't really try to think in terms of how do I define what we're doing and put it in a box. What I'm trying to do is to look at what is the next tipping point, and how as a society can we respond to that. Though I do understand that sometimes labels have their place and their purpose. Especially when you look at, for example, global collaboration. You need to have some kind of definition so that you can put a framework around what you are collectively doing. So it has its place, but on the ground, in Nigeria, it doesn't seem that meaningful anymore.
We have time for maybe one or two quick questions. The first one's not going to be so quick, but I'll ask Kudus if you can answer it quickly. Over the last several weeks, and particularly with the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, the issue of radicalization and extremism within refugee populations, which is a perennial issue, has come up again. We saw this also with just migrant populations coming to the U.S. over the last several election cycles. And there's a lot of anecdotal stories about that, but I'd like you, if you could, to share your perspective on the issue, whether it's a fair concern. If it isn't, might it become one, or how should we think about it?
I think, Michael, it's the red herring again. I think that, one of the things that I think that we've gotten right is that we have a very robust vetting process for refugees that are coming from the outside in. In fact, if you listen to the experts, they think that not having a robust resettlement program is worse for our national security. There is no evidence that shows that there are refugees that are coming in and through these pipelines. And I think that this whole issue of refugees coming in, and again, it goes back to this sort of fear of the other, right? And we have a huge demographical crisis in Europe, where there are certain countries that are not going to, they just don't have the growth rate to sustain their current standard of living. But yet, I was talking to a member of parliament from Germany a few months ago, and this is somebody who is really vehemently against refugees coming in, and in particular from Muslim countries. And I said to him that, look, and he said that, look, I mean, my people, they're afraid. They are afraid of, and I'm not saying that the people are not, but the leader, remember this, that the leader is the one that has the responsibility. It's not, none of this is being driven, the Muslim that becomes radicalized and becomes a jihadi, is somebody who is the leadership that is responsible for that, right? So, and I said to him that, this member of parliament, that have you ever told them that if the current growth rate sustains, the standard of living of Germany is going to plummet, right? You need people, and where are those people coming from? So I think that this issue in the U.S., we see this, with our former president, right, where his entire campaign really took off in 2016. If you remember when he made that comment about Mexicans coming over from the southern border, and he called them, all sorts of bad things. And I think that somehow resonated to the fringe right in the U.S., and that has become his most vocal supporter. So I think that anything that is spreading hate, that is mistrustful of the other, I think is something that we should have a red flag against, and we should know that this is something that we need to counter.
Thank you very much. And in 20 seconds or less, I know it's tight, one thing that gives you hope from each of you about where we are at in working to address violent extremism today. We'll start with you, Dr. Akilu.
What a great place to end on a hopeful note. One thing that gives me hope is that there is more global collaboration, that people are working together, communities have more awareness, and also communities have less tolerance for extremism, whereas in the past there was a lot of recruitment from within communities. That is slowing down, so people are saying no to hate, so that gives me hope.
A lot of things give me hope. This forum gives me hope. The ability to come together and exchange these ideas, and having the space to express disagreement. There's a saying of the Holy Prophet of Islam, peace be upon him, that disagreement is a source of blessings. And I think that awareness, we need to get beyond this. I believe in the inherent goodness of everybody. There's a very, very small percentage of people that we all may have our disagreements, but the isolating the bad is not that difficult, and I think that we're moving in the right direction, whatever the terms are, and I think we will be able to beat this thing.
And Jeppe, last word from you.
I also think we're able to beat this. We have the architecture around here now that we have built upon for a while to address any form of extremism. That gives me hope, also with the new changes and technologies and the REMV conversation. And also it gives me hope that ordinary prevent workers, at least here, are now trying to work online, and they are also addressing the more non-violent parts of extremism, the everyday hate, the racism. That is a newer and bigger things where many more people can be engaged in the important conversation.
Well, I am hopeful from conversations like this and from colleagues like you, knowing that you're working to address it. So we'll end it on that note. Thank you all very much for joining the panel, and thank you to our audience.
It's a pleasure, Michael. Thank you.
Yes.